This video is on MSK pharmacology. It's just going to wrap up any loose ends, any drugs that we didn't cover thus far. One of the drugs, let's say a patient has sustained muscle contraction, muscle cramp, and can't relax, we can give them a muscle relaxant. We can give them benzos, but we want something a little bit more specific. We don't want to just give benzos like candy, so we give a muscle relaxant. And these include things like baclofen and cyclobenzaprine. They work in the brain. They work kind of like benzos actually, but comes with less side effects of benzos. So they work like benzos. That would mean they work on GABA. So they are GABA agonists. In particular, GABA type B receptors. And by working on these peculiar receptors, they think this is what gives that muscle relaxant without all the other things that come with benzos. All right, so that's muscle relaxant. Let's say they don't have sustained muscle cramp, but they just have muscular pain or pain in general. An entire video talking about these autoimmune disorders that cause, this systemic pain. And we want to treat that pain. We start conservatively, try and exercise, try and reduce any triggers, and then you start moving slowly into things like NSAIDs and things like corticosteroids, and then you might move a little bit further. But we always want to try the more conservative route first and then slowly build up. So we're going to talk about things like NSAIDs and things like corticosteroids, and we can't talk about those without talking about the pathway. So what causes that initial pain and inflammation to start with? Well, in your plasma membrane, it holds something called arachidonic acid. This is kind of like emergency alarms to have, like, those emergency boxes that says break glass here if there's an emergency, and you break the glass, pull the alarm, and it sounds the alarm. Well, this is the exact same thing. So you have a little box, your plasma membrane, and inside you have arachidonic acid, and if there's any sign of damage, then you kind of break that glass, arachidonic acid comes out. The thing that breaks that glass is going to be phospholipase A2. Judging by the name, it works on phospholipids, and it kind of cuts the phospholipids and it cuts out that arachidonic acid, and that arachidonic acid is free to leave the plasma membrane. So it leaves the plasma membrane, now it's free. And there's two routes it can go to. It can go the leukotriene route. I'll just write leukotriene route. And it makes leukotrienes. The initial enzyme that works on it is going to be lipoxygenase. And this becomes precursors like 5-HPETE and LTA4. And LTA4 will eventually become things like LTB4, LTC4, D4, E4. Now, LTB4 is the main one because we're talking about things like pain. So this is a chemotactic agent for neutrophils. Chemotactic for neutrophils. And that brings in neutrophils, brings in the pain. LTC to E, these are all things that cause bronchospasms. Hopefully you remember this pathway in our earlier talks about inflammation, even in our talks about in our respiratory block, because this causes bronchospasm, it's seen as a causative agent in things like asthma. And so we have a lot of drugs that block this when we're talking about asthma. If you recall, we can block leukotriene binding with montelukast, or we can just block this whole pathway outright by blocking lipoxygenase with things like xylutine. And so these are just respiratory drugs that help with asthma. A little aside because we're talking about MSK in this block, but just remember everything kind of builds on itself. So don't forget these important facts. But LTB4 is the thing that causes chemotactic agents, neutrophils to come in, brings the pain. Now, what's the other pathway it can go on? What can go on another pathway? And the enzyme that works on this is cyclooxygenase, also known as COX, COX-1 and COX-2. And similar to here, it makes a precursor called prostaglandin H2. And prostaglandin H2 can make a ton of things. It can go to platelets, and platelets will turn into TXA2 or thromboxane A2, and that causes platelets to come together. platelet aggregation. It can also make prostaglandin proper. So these are the actual prostaglandins that we usually think about when we talk about prostaglandins. So prostaglandins PGE1, PGE2, PGF2. And these cause the pain, the fever, the inflammation that we are accustomed to talking about when we talk about prostaglandins. It can also turn into PGI2, and PGI2 is like the mortal enemy of TXA2. So PGI2 actually causes platelets to not aggregate, so I would say decrease platelet aggregation, and causes vasodilation. Again, makes it harder for the platelets to aggregate. And that is your cyclooxygenase. Now there's something else your prostaglandins do that has a life outside of inflammation. Your prostaglandins also help maintain your gastric mucosa, so it's good for that. Also helps maintain renal function. We need that. So right, renal function. I mean, how does it do that? Well, why do you think we have COX-1 and COX-2? Why would we need two enzymes? Well, COX-1 is the thing that helps maintain these normal functions. Maintain functions. So maintaining your gastric mucosa, maintaining your renal function. COX-2 is more seen in inflammatory cells, and this enzyme is the one that causes the inflammation. So it's a fine balance, yeah? It has a life outside of inflammation, and by using different enzymes at different locations, we can kind of achieve that balance that we're looking for. One last thing I want to talk about. Something else works on cyclooxygenase and kind of revs up the cycle, and it is a protein complex. This protein complex is called NF-κB, all right, protein complex, and helps mediate inflammation. So it can also rev up cyclooxygenase. That's just a rundown on the pathway. Now let's see how we can manipulate it to kind of reduce that pain, reduce that inflammation. Some big drugs would be your corticosteroids. Corticosteroids, they do a ton of things through a ton of different mechanisms, but because we're talking about inflammation here, and because we're talking about this particular pathway, corticosteroids are so potent in reducing inflammation because they block the enzymes you need the most. They block the first enzyme, phospholipase A2. So phospholipase A2. By blocking that, you don't have the pathway. Simple as that. So that's why they're so potent. They can also, what else do we have that starts the pathway? NF-κB, they'll block that too. So they block everything, every possible thing you can think of. So blocks NF-κB. How does it do that? It creates inhibitory KB. You can guess what that does. That inhibits NF-κB. So I'll just write inhibit. So by blocking the two main players, then you just don't have the pathway, and that's why it's so potent. So those are your corticosteroids. Now, if we don't want to jump to corticosteroids because they have so much side effects, we can give something a little bit milder, things you can find over the counter. These would be things like COX inhibitors. These are things called NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. How perfect is that name, right? So NSAIDs, non-steroidal because it's not steroids, and these work by blocking cyclooxygenase. It can block both COX-1 and COX-2. And by blocking that, you get to reduce pain, you get to reduce inflammation, you get reduced fever. So I'll just write reduce signs. But you can imagine, like I said, things like prostaglandins have a life outside of inflammation. They have to maintain your gastric mucosa, they have to retain your renal function. So your side effects you can imagine include things like GIT upset, ulcers, bleedings, renal failure because you can no longer maintain that renal function. If you recall, prostaglandins help dilate your afferent arteriole, so if you don't have that, you kind of constrict and reduce renal function. So renal function, these are your general NSAIDs. These are things like ibuprofen. You can have more specialized ones like aspirin. Aspirin blocks both, but why is it different then? Because it irreversibly blocks it by acetylating it. That just means putting an acetyl group on it, acetylation. And at low doses, really likes to block TXA2, so it kind of stops that platelet aggregation. And so we use that for preventing clots. So low doses stops clots. And at medium, high doses, then they start working on things like inflammation, fever, stuff like that. Inflammation, fever. Some side effects. Well, the general side effects of GIT upset, renal failure. Also seems to be toxic to your cranial nerve 8. So that's for auditory, so CN8, is that right? Tinnitus. Also, in overdoses, you can have hyperventilation. That causes respiratory alkalosis. Alkalosis. And then one thing you should never ever forget, do not give aspirin for kids that have things like fever and inflammation. It's a common enough drug, but if you look on the back of the label, it says don't give it for kids, because if you give it to kids, they can have liver failure. We call that RISE syndrome. RISE syndrome. Hopefully these terms are kind of ringing a bell. We talked about it earlier, so it can cause RISE syndrome. That's aspirin. There's another special NSAID, and this is celecoxib. And celecoxib is COX-2 specific. So it blocks COX-2. That's the one that's seen more in inflammation. And by doing that, great, we have reduced inflammation without all the other side effects. So reduce inflammation, less GIT side effects. However, it seems to particularly like to block PGI2. And by blocking PGI2 and leaving kind of TXA in place, you have more platelet aggregation, more clots, and less of its counter-regulatory brother PGI2. And because you have more clots, side effects of this is increased risk of thrombosis. You absolutely need to know that. So increased risk of CVS disease, risk, thrombosis, all that stuff, because you have increased clots. And last but not least, it is a sulfur drug. So a patient has a sulfur allergy, and they might ask you what drug you want to take. Try and do NSAIDs instead. All right, you might get enticed because it says less GIT problems, but it's a sulfur drug, so they'll have a sulfur reaction, so you just do general NSAIDs. Last thing I want to talk about is going to be acetaminophen. That's Tylenol. That is one of the oldest and most classic drugs. So acetaminophen. And acetaminophen seems to block COX also, but it seems to block it preferentially in the CNS, in the brain. It seems to be inactivated peripherally. All right, so it works in the brain. You can figure that it will reduce things like fever. So reduce fever and pain, because those can be centrally controlled, but it doesn't really work so much for inflammation. If you have inflammation from here, from all those inflammatory cells coming in and creating cytokines and all that gunk, if it works in the brain, it's not going to really work on that inflammation. So I'll just write, doesn't really work well with inflammation. So it's used more for fever, for pain. Why would you give acetaminophen? Well, if you have fever, if you have a kid that has fever and pain, and you say, wait, Mike just said I can't give him aspirin. So what's an alternative? Acetaminophen would be an alternative. So you can give this for kids to avoid RISE syndrome. Avoid RISE syndrome. Some side effects. When acetaminophen is metabolized, it creates this really, really dangerous free radical called NAPQI. The full name is in my notes. And this free radical will go into your liver, and your liver will freak out. And thankfully for us, we have free radical scavengers, especially glutathione. Now, glutathione is, as great as it is very limited. So glutathione will pick up that NAPQI, but if you're overdosing on it, if you're taking too much of it, then sooner or later glutathione will run out. When it runs out, then this metabolite, this free radical, has free reign over your liver and just destroys your liver. So how do we counteract that? What's the antidote? We can give N-acetylcysteine. N-acetylcysteine just replenishes that glutathione and kind of allows it to do its job again. Okay, so that's the mechanism. You need to know the mechanism of that antidote, because a lot of times they try and trick you. They might say they gave them N-acetylcysteine, and how did it work? Did it increase renal excretion? No, that's not what it does. Does it increase GIT excretion? No, it doesn't do that. Does it block conversion? No, it doesn't do that. It just increases glutathione. Okay, so that's the mechanism of it. Those are your drugs. Hope that wraps up any loose ends in MSK pharmacology, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.